Welcome back, ScreamAgers, to yet another episode of the Canon, your favorite movie podcast, the one and only movie podcast, providing you with a watch list of the most essential movies ever made. My name is Raf. I'll be hosting us for today. We've got another essential movie, and we've got the one and only Bob Cram Jr. of ScreamAge Wasteland joining us to talk about said movie. If you didn't get a chance to listen to last week's episode, Duke, Ramon, and I have officially renamed October as Bobtober because, Bob, this is your month. This is your time to shine. So welcome to Bobtober.
Welcome to Bobtober, ScreamAgers. Happy to have you.
Well, we're happy to have you on the show, Bob, to talk about this movie, The Evil Dead. I assume, based on some past conversations that we've had, that this is a very important movie to you in particular. Obviously, a very important movie within the horror genre and within, the canon at large. So very, very, very excited to talk to you about this one.
Yeah, me too. Looking forward to it.
We've both got our Bobtober vibes set to 11 at the moment. We're recording this on a lovely autumn Saturday morning. We've both got, I don't have pumpkin spice in my coffee, but you've got your pumpkin spice coffee going. I've got my coffee going. The weather is like a perfect, 61 and sunny. I've got a pumpkin candle that I'm burning right now. The mood is unbelievably set for both of us. So that's good news.
Yeah. Yeah, the wind's blowing outside. Leaves are everywhere. I'm not going to think about raking those up for at least a week.
Are you wearing a flannel shirt?
I am not, but I'm wearing a fleece. So
okay.
I mean, it's more like 54 here than.
Ooh, that's
so it's
perfect.
a little more chill to the air.
Yeah, but I mean, it really is just. How can you not be romantic about October?
Yeah.
I know the line's supposed to be, how can you not be romantic about baseball, which is a totally another story. You add in.
Congrats to the Mets, FYI. So.
Oh, thank you. Really just a mix of all my favorite things. The Mets playing October baseball. We've got good scary movies and spooky movies to talk about here on the Canon. The weather is perfect. There's apple cider donuts everywhere. It's truly just like a remarkable time to be alive,
Yeah. I mean, if you love spooky season, this is your time to shine for sure. So
this is it. Once again, that's why we're calling it Bobtober, because you are the spooky movie guy.
I am trademarking that. There we go.
Yeah.
It's to be honest, we used to do a get together here every October, and we called it Bobtoberfest. So
Bobtoberfest.
Yeah, so not too far removed. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Have a couple of nice ales, a couple of beers, celebrate Bobtoberfest.
Watch some great horror movies.
Yeah. Amazing. So, like we said, today we're going to be talking about The Evil Dead, which is just very much so a classic within the horror genre. And I feel like, obviously, with it being Bobtober, you were the obvious choice to have on for this episode. But I do feel like this horror movie in particular is one that, based on what I've read from both the review that you wrote for this and the actual written canon article that you wrote for this, that this is a movie that is very near and dear to your heart. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I had watched a lot of horror movies growing up, and as a little kid, whatever was on cable and whatever I could sneak out to catch on either HBO, or there used to be like a classic horror film thing that would run on the local channels at like midnight. And my parents would sometimes watch that, and I would sneak out and watch over the couch, back of the couch to see things. But that was all like movies like Trog or Vincent Price movie or something like that. It was never anything. They didn't even do like Night of the Living Dead or anything. But this was the first movie I ever picked for myself to watch as a horror movie, that I was like, as soon as I got a chance to actually go and pick a horror movie to watch for myself, this was the one. And I know you've read the story, but it's at the beginning of the VHS rental phenomena, there was a store in Millinocket, which is the town that I grew up in. And the minute that I had enough cash saved up to rent this, I traveled to the video store, rented this, had to rent the machine because we were too poor to have a VHS machine. And this is back in the day, the VHS things were roughly the size of an air conditioner and about as heavy. And I dragged that whole thing about 2 miles across town to where we lived and set it up and plugged it in, and we were away. And as I've mentioned before, the scariest part of that movie for me was my mom watched it with us.
Oh, wow.
Which was, and I technically was too young to rent the movie, but it was a small town and it wasn't a porno, so they didn't really care.
How old were you?
I don't know, 13, 14, maybe.
Okay.
And they got to the part of the film, which is the most excruciating part of the film, which is the tree rape scene. And just before that started, my mom got up and went into the kitchen to make popcorn. And the entire time that scene was going on, I kept my eyes kept flicking to the kitchen where my mom was. And if she comes in, she's turning this off and making me return it.
Yeah.
So that was the scariest part of the movie for me was, am I going to get to see this whole movie?
Wow.
Or is mom going to be like, get this filth out of my house?
Yeah. What are the odds that she gets up during that scene in particular?
I know. I'm still actually kind of shocked she let us watch the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, the rest of the movie is, pretty intense, but I mean, that scene in particular, yeah, you're going to make your, 13-year-old son turn that off.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And then who knows? Maybe then you're not the horror savant that you are today,
Right. Maybe it ends up being like Steve Toberfest or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Damn you, Steve. Steve is cool. We still like Steve, whoever Steve is.
Whoever Steve is.
That's wild. How did you come across this movie or know to rent it?
Yeah. Cause we didn't, the movie theater in town had closed years before. There was a drive-in in the 1970s, but that had closed many years before as well. And our access to cable was pretty spotty. It was pretty much whoever we could steal it off from, who was a neighbor at the time. So the only outlet that I had for horror as a horror fan was my friend Johnny got Fangoria as a subscription.
Nice.
And so I saw, images from tons of films through Fangoria. That's the place that I first heard about a lot of movies. And that's the place that I first heard about Evil Dead. They even got a cover story on it. And I remember looking through it and being like, this movie sounds dangerous. I mean, there's this picture of this guy with a bloody axe. And I remember distinctly reading the words bodily dismemberment in the article and being like, oh man, I don't know if I should see this movie.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to see this movie. So yeah, that it had built up in my mind to this epic thing. And it was my only choice for rental. I guess I was lucky that they even had a copy.
The term bodily dismemberment made me want to hit the groovy sounder on the soundboard. But unfortunately, we're having some technical issues with that, and it's not working. So I've been waiting. I've had groovy on the the soundboard for a while, and that was like the perfect chance to use it. But another day. That's awesome though that you. So this was like not like a holy grail movie, but this was. It seemed like as like a 13-year-old who's getting into the genre, this was like the perfect movie for you to watch.
Yeah.
At that time, to like really just like take the fandom of the genre to the next level. Right. And did it do that, do you think, for you?
Oh yeah. No, I think it absolutely cemented one, my interest in horror movies as a whole, but also just an interest in filmmaking, because, I don't think I'd enjoyed a lot of movies, but I had never really paid attention to the idea of a director as an auteur. That even though I'd seen Hitchcock films and all kinds of movies, I have never really thought about the director as author. And that was the first time that I'd be like, who is this Sam Raimi guy that does all this crazy crap that I'd never seen in a movie at all up to that point? I think, if you've seen it in the modern day, filmmaking, whether they know it or not, owe a lot of how they shoot films now, with the dynamic camera movement and angles and editing and sound effects. There's a lot that Evil Dead did first, somewhat out of necessity, but also just out of the crazy brain of Sam Raimi.
Yeah.
And I really had never seen anything like it. So it was a revelation about, oh, you can put your stamp, you can put your vision in a film, and it will stand out as something that you as a director have done, and not just a group effort that comes out with a product. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's one of those movies that can, and not in a bad way, like draw your attention to the idea that there are like people who are making artistic choices for these movies. They're putting their stamp on it in a way. It like opened your eyes to the idea of filmmaking as a concept, which I think for most young film fans is like always not the pivotal moment, but among the pivotal moments of the like journey of being a film fan, where you're like, oh, someone decided to move the camera that way. Someone decided to add in that sound effect there. Someone decided to, use this angle for a shot. And I think when you like first have that realization, that movie is always going to stick out to you in like your journey of film fandom. So, and The Evil Dead is like very much so a movie that I can see, doing that for someone. So it's awesome that, this was the movie that sort of like opened your eyes to that idea.
I know. It's funny, right? Because, other people, I always think of, Gloria Katz, and they were the producers on George Lucas's first feature film, not THX 1178, but American Graffiti. And they made a horror movie called Messiah of Evil. Anyway, but they were turned on to movies by like Michael Antonioni, and I'm like, if you go to film school, the filmmakers that do that for you are substantially different than if you're renting horror movies in a backwater in Maine.
Yeah, but I feel like at the end of the day, like it serves the same purpose. It's just like we all get there in different ways.
Yeah.
So like for me, it was probably like Tarantino, where I was like,
right,
like, oh, you like someone is making this. Like there's like a moment, there's like a before you have that realization where movies just sort of like exist. And when you watch them, you're just like, yeah, that's a thing that exists within the world. But then you have that sort of like eye-opening moment of, no, someone made this. People decided to make this, and their effort and their stamp and their choices and sensibilities are all like reflected in what it is that I'm watching. And that's obviously true of every movie, but until you have that one movie that opens up or like unlocks that door for you, you don't really realize it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I wonder sometimes if like the vast majority of people never have that moment.
Yeah.
Like they're always just consuming movies as the end product. And then at some point in time, it's like eating a meal. Most people just eat a food at a restaurant and they don't think about the people who make that food. But then there are some people who follow chefs and eat at particular restaurants and particular kinds of food. There's that awareness of how things are made that awakens you to a larger world, I think. So yeah, agreed.
Absolutely. And with this movie in particular, you mentioned the name, and I guess we can just, talk about him and everything now. Sam Raimi, absolute lunatic. And I mean that in the most flattering way possible. How old was he when he made this movie?
I believe he was 21 when they started. He was still in college at the time. And they were all extremely, extremely young people. Rob Tappert was the producer was probably the oldest. But Sam was, ridiculously young and had never made an actual full-length feature film before. He and his friends, including Bruce Campbell, had actually made a ton of like Super 8 amateur films together, but they had never actually gotten together and tried to make a full-length feature before. And they just didn't know what they were in for. And if they did know, maybe they wouldn't have tried.
Yeah, there's something to the idea of the like ignorance of youth or like the bravado of youth, where you can just like go out and do this because you don't know any better.
Right.
And that's almost, or not even almost, it was like it worked to their benefit. It's also interesting when you think about just like this genre and who the stories are usually about. It's like usually about young people who get into hairy situations because of their bravado and ignorance as young people. Like they don't have the wisdom to tell them to not put themselves in said situations.
Right.
So like it's cool that like the making of the movie kind of reflects like the stories that are usually told within the genre.
Yeah, that's true. Yep. It was a horror show about making a horror show. Yeah. So.
Yeah. 21, just like, that's absolutely insane. So he was still in school when he
in Detroit, or in Michigan anyway. I mean, they're from Detroit, but in Michigan, not State. Exactly. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Not exactly the center of filmmaking.
No, like you don't think of Michigan as like a hotbed of cinematic genius.
No, but it's interesting because you wouldn't have thought of like Pittsburgh being the center of cinematic anything either. And then you get George Romero, who also makes a huge splash in a low budget horror feature. So
yeah,
maybe there's just something about these sort of,
the Rust Belt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like Pittsburgh, Detroit. I don't even know what other cities we would consider in the Rust Belt. Maybe like Cleveland or something.
Right.
We're waiting for the next wave of great, young, brash, like do-it-yourself horror filmmaking is waiting for us in the city of Cleveland, Ohio.
Somebody's going to come and be like, well, actually, there's, and there will be a list of of filmmakers from Cleveland that we just don't know anything
We don't
about.
know. Yeah.
I have somewhere in my library a book of just regional horror films. I should dig that out and see if there is any.
Interesting. But funnily enough, this movie doesn't take place in Michigan.
No.
It takes place in Tennessee, right?
Yes, it does. Yes,
Which
it does.
I feel like the location isn't that important, but it does feel, I don't know, it does feel, I feel like a lot of like horror stuff is really tied to like regional identities. Like what you're able to do in the Northeast will be different from, you know, what it is that you're able to do in the Midwest as opposed to like the South or the far West or whatever. So like Tennessee, for some reason, Tennessee makes a lot more sense for this movie to take place than if it were to have taken place at a cabin in Michigan, which might just be like, you know, like hindsight is 2020 or we're just playing the results. But there is something about that particular location of the, you know, the mountains in Western Tennessee that feels like more scary than just like sparse suburbs within Michigan.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can't imagine that they could have found that long, rambling driveway down to the cabin somewhere in Michigan. Maybe they could have, but it feels very specific to that place. And then you know, when you go to Evil Dead 2, which is filmed almost entirely on a stage, it feels very different. You know, there's far less of a sense of place than you get with the original Evil Dead, and I do think it adds to that atmosphere.
So Raimi and his buddies, a bunch of 20-something-year-olds, after having made a bunch of short, mostly like slapstick comedies,
Yep.
I think
Yeah.
you wrote in the review, they decided, hey, we should make a feature-length film because screw it. Why the hell not? You know?
Right. I love that quote from Raimi, which was something like, why did you decide to make a feature film? And he's like, I just thought I'd run from reality as long as possible until they dragged me back to my dad's store. Yeah. So
Right.
it's just, he's like, as long as somebody's going to give me the chance to do something weird and interesting, I'm going to do that instead of engage in commercial retail.
Yeah. It's so, you know, obviously when you hear stories of people just, you know, going for it and making the movie and not worrying about the budget or like worrying about whether or not it's going to be bad. Obviously, you know, not all of us who are going to make movies when we're 21 years old are going to have the like inherent talent and voice that someone like Sam Raimi has.
Right.
But at the same time, you never know unless you just freaking do it. And that is, I think the fact that he just decided to go out and do it at that age, with that budget, with that lack of experience and knowledge or whatever, is just as inspiring or just as awe-inspiring as any of his like technical skills as a filmmaker and storyteller.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. He must have inspired so many filmmakers. I mean, you know, my brothers and sister and I once tried to go and make a horror movie in the woods at a cabin, almost directly inspired by this particular production, because it made it seem like, well, if these idiots can do it, come on.
Yeah.
It turns out it's a lot freaking harder than it looks.
Yeah.
And if we'd known the entire story, maybe we wouldn't have tried, but it was still fun to make that effort and feel like you're part of a lineage that includes Sam Raimi and people like him.
But you never know unless you try.
Yeah.
And it's better to have tried and maybe learned that you're not Sam Raimi, or that's better than never trying. And you realize when you're on your deathbed, wow, I
Right.
could have been Sam Raimi.
Yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
could have made The Evil Dead.
And there's 100 for every 100 people that tried and didn't do it. You get somebody like, wow, perhaps I should not. Maybe I should have drunk more coffee before this started. But Peter Jackson, who also, basically starts out making no budget, personal, crappy horror movies and ends up being a big budget director as well.
Yeah. So it's like they really had no experience making movies. They hadn't really made any horror movies. This movie, like how then did they come up with the idea for The Evil Dead? Because this is like some pretty out there stuff, some pretty wild stuff. I know, like, when you like strip it down and you're like, okay, this is just a story about a bunch of kids who go to a remote location and some bad stuff happens, which, yes, that can be a pretty standard formula for a spooky movie. But the whole, like, there's a lot of like lore building, and like there's like all this background with the the book and the guide in the woods and all this like crazy stuff. Like, how did they come up with this? Do you know?
Right. Well, I mean, they had decided they were going to make a film, to try and make an actual feature film before college ended and they'd have to go to the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted to make sure they could sell it. So they kind of went around to see what was the most popular sort of genre. And this was the heyday of the drive-in movie. And it was, the cheapest thing that we can make that is the most popular are horror movies. We haven't really made horror movies before. So in order to prove that we can do this and to ourselves, and in order to have something that we can show to potential investors, they shot a short horror film called Into the Woods, which had a lot of the same, generic things. It was in a farmhouse instead of a cabin, but there was a force in the woods and it would possess people and things would get gory and goopy. And you can still find it on YouTube occasionally, I think. The versions that I've seen have been pretty low quality. So at some point in time, I'm sure somebody will, if they haven't already, find it and restore it. But it was enough for them to say, okay, we can do this. And they found a guy who could do special effects, and that's who they ended up using on the film. And it was enough to be able to show to investors and say, we're going to make something like this, but a feature film, and this shows you what we're capable of. And that was basically how they started. And then Sam just wrote like a 60-page screenplay, something like that. Something extremely, I think Bruce Campbell says that that's about 40 pages less than your average screenplay should be.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was just filled in as they went. They knew they wanted the book. They knew they wanted some kind of demon possession thing. And they knew that they wanted as much blood as possible. And I think a lot of the world building is just incidental.
Yeah.
Until they build on it in later films. But they just got, this sounds cool. Let's add this. Oh, so-and-so did this cool piece of artwork. Let's build a whole book around that. And yeah, it feels like a series of coincidences that all combined to make something greater than the individual parts of it.
I love it. It's that's amazing. It's not so much a happy accident, but it's just like, again, just like that sort of carefree, easygoing kind of approach that you can have when you are this young in filmmaking, and like things just sort of like fall into place, right? Like you don't have to go out, and there doesn't have to be an intention to build a lasting franchise. You can just like stumble upon it, just like, oh, we want to throw this in, we want to throw that in. this sounds cool over here. This will be fun for us to do. And then, you just take it from there.
Yeah. And it sounds like, as the shoot went on, and into the depths of winter, and they lost cast members to previous projects and other commitments, and it of necessity boiled down to just Bruce,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of stand-ins.
Yeah.
It was almost like it awakened something in Raimi, because that's where you start to get all of these innovative shots, these weird camera angles, and the sound effects, and just the intense close-ups and things, where he's trying to make it visually interesting when he didn't have the distraction of a cast. And
Yeah.
so I think it was kind of necessity that created this vision that he ended up running with for like the rest of his career.
Yeah. I feel like that's always interesting when sort of like the limitations of what it is that you're able to make then force these like amazing moments of creativity and innovation, if you will. Like I feel like with all of the Hitchcock episodes that we've done, we often talk about how the studio system sort of like trying to keep a stranglehold on him and the movies that he was able to make, then like forced him to do the things that he wanted to do in more creative ways. Limitations of money and cast and crew sort of then like forced Raimi's hand in making something that is still interesting, but in ways that aren't standard to like what you're used to with filmmaking. And, we try not to do it a lot on the show, but just for a moment to do like the contemporary, like guy who complains about contemporary cinema thing. When you just like have unlimited funds and can just like, throw money at everything, we're like not teaching filmmakers how to like make films, because all of their problems can just be solved by throwing a bunch of money at it, as opposed to, like, oh, we had to shoot X scene this way because we had no other option because we had no money,
Right. Yeah.
And when that gets lost, like a lot of the creativity, a lot of the innovation and, like the rule breaking, like all that stuff gets kind of lost as we're just able to continuously throw money at things. So that's my quick ramble, and I can't do the ramble on sound, but that's my quick ramble on the current state of cinema.
Yeah. No, I think, and I think people have been making the same observation for quite some time, and I think we go through cycles where technology will occasionally democratize filmmaking again. Mm-hmm. For things in the 80s, it was the advent of home video. When suddenly filmmakers could sort of circumvent the distribution process and get things, not that this film did, which they didn't at all, but mm-hmm. Some filmmakers were able to get things into a distribution stream that they would never have been able to even 10 years before. And with the advent of digital video, I think the same thing sort of happened in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And then now we've kind of lost that again. I don't know why that is, but it seems to go in cycles. So we're about due for some other technological marvel to make things easier for independent filmmakers for a short while.
You'd think that the smartphone would be that thing.
Right.
But it seems like it hasn't really hit or connected in ways that are like, forcing or creating this world and vibe of creativity and boom and, democratizing who's able to make movies, but then also like forcing people to be innovative in the way that they're making films. Like it definitely has democratized the fact that we're all able to create things, but then like Like no one's like using shooting on iPhones to like create new cinematic language. It's just like, oh, we're all just going to like set up a tripod and a ring light and shoot things like the same way as, 8 million other people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The only thing that you get is, people make use of it for found footage films, but that's already got its own cinematic language that was created earlier. So it's hard to do something new with that too. So
yeah. All right. We'll put a pin in that conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
Hopefully something will come of iPhones and filmmaking, but back to The Evil Dead. And so like the movie itself, it's got this insane sort of backstory of how it came to be. Just a bunch of bozos, for lack of a better word, deciding, hey, let's make a movie. But the movie itself, Bob, like what in particular has stood out to you when you were first watching it? Like, what do you think it is about the actual movie beyond the sort of like amazing background of it that really stands out to you and is the reason for it sort of like clicking with audiences and, still being so effective 40 plus years later?
Right. And I'll be interested to hear what your first experience with this was too, because for me watching it in the 1980s, there is humor in the film, and they lean heavily into the humor for future installments of it. But watching this for the first time, it was, as the tagline said, the ultimate experience in grueling horror. It really was a scary movie. Watching it today, like I watched it Thursday, we're recording on a Saturday. And I was like, it's kind of a cheap ass film. The acting is not particularly too great. Some of the edits early on are a little cheesy. There are all kinds of like little continuity errors that crop up, especially as they ran out of time to shoot in the cabin and stuff. And so they ended up having to do pickups in like, Rob Tappert's family's basement. Or there's one particular shot that gets me every time now. And it's Ash coming down into the stairs late in the movie, and you're looking up and you can see the wood paneling of the hallway in his parents' house. It's like, but that's what they had. That's all that they had. But watching it the first time, it was so gritty and intense, and there were so many close-ups, and the gore was excessive, even if it wasn't particularly realistic, that it felt like you almost were like watching a snuff film. It felt so down and dirty, really. Yeah. And there are elements in it that I remember being just like disturbed by. Ellen Sandweiss's character, Shelley, when she first gets possessed and they end up putting her in the basement, and they would just do these occasional shots of her looking out of the trap door with the light just going over her eyes, and the makeup effects felt so good at the time that I was like, how did they even freaking do that? She looks like a demon. So my first experience of it was, this was an intensely horrifying horror movie, and it felt real in a way that other films didn't, because of the sort of guerrilla way that they made it. They didn't make it feel safe. There are very few, if any, establishing shots. There are very few of the standard, this person talks on one side of the screen and this person answers on the other side of the screen. Everything, like this scene is all completely at a 45-degree angle for no reason other than it unsettles you. Yeah. Even stupid things like the whole scene where the car is parked and Bruce gets out and he walks towards us, and the car appears perfectly level and Bruce appears at like an almost 45-degree angle as he walks towards the camera. I'm like, what is happening here?
Yeah.
So, and there is humor in the film. It is probably, if not the originator of the splat stick genre, certainly one of the earliest examples thereof. But the humor did not hit me the first few times that I saw it. It was only in later views.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I I came to this movie a little bit later in life. So the first time that I saw it, I think I was aware of the sort of like cult status of The Evil Dead 2, and a lot of people thinking that it was like the funniest movie of all time, and feel like people having similar feelings about The Evil Dead. But I still think that this is a pretty terrifying movie for a lot of the reasons that you were saying. Like, this movie is really down and dirty. It's really grimy. It's extremely gory. And, again, not to like compare things to nowadays, but the gore in this, I think, is more effective than like, the torture porn gore that we get in like the Saw movies, because it is, it's like kind of over the top. It's very not comedic, but I don't really know how to explain it, but it's like an expressive form of gore, which to me, I think is really effective within this particular world. Like, it doesn't need to be realistic, but it is still extremely, extremely gory in terms of like what's happening to people. We're getting like bodies chopped up. We're getting demonic possessions. We're getting even just like a fingernail on the face will then cause like insane amounts of blood to pour out of, someone's head,
Yep.
So, and then like all of this, like the makeup design and special effects for the demon characters, to me, was like super, super scary, even if they are like borderline funny. I'm forgetting the character. It's not, is it Cheryl, or Cheryl's the sister?
Cheryl's the sister.
Who's in the
Linda?
basement. Is Linda the one who has like the almost like clownish makeup on her face and
Yes.
is like doing the laughing? Like,
yeah,
that, like, I think depending on the day, that could be read as being a little funny or like extremely terrifying. And for me, most times when I've watched this movie, I fall into the latter. Like, I find it very, very, very terrifying.
Yeah. No, she's super unsettling, and it's always great to me because she's kind of a very bland character,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not even sure if she's a good actress, and then these scenes of her with that kind of Cupid doll sort of makeup and that high pitched giggling, and that's really disturbing.
Yeah.
I think the humor comes from it almost always from Bruce Campbell when he's like telling her to shut up and doing the very big swings to slap her.
Yeah.
That's a little, but she herself is. And who would have thought, except for maybe Ridley Scott, that somebody spewing milk out of their mouth would be as disturbing as that is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what shocked me the most, not specifically the milk, but the level of gore and grotesque that's in this movie is, I think, something that is still very impressive and boundary pushing even 40 years later. And I really do want to emphasize that, like, even with everything that we've gotten in terms of modern horror movies, like, I still think that this is one of the best examples of how to do really over the top, effective, grotesque sort of gore and stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I love that they, a lot of low budget horror films run out of money over the course of the shoot, and then the ending suffers as a result. They have par effects or they just run out of steam, and it's kind of a downer. But Raimi and co. really did not allow that to happen. Some of the most gory and impressive special effects don't even happen until almost the very end. Those hands coming out of their torsos and throwing lots of viscera out, the face melting and falling apart, the bugs and poor, Bruce Campbell getting dog food thrown into his face. But it's all, that was an epic end to this long, already pretty gory movie. And then there's this, epic sequence of horrifying, gory nonsense that comes at the end. And it was a really good punch at the end of the movie that made you leave feeling like you got your money's worth. Yeah.
It's very exciting in how gory and over the top it is. It is like, it's both it's still like, a very scary movie, I think, can scare you in many ways, but it's also extremely exciting in how over the top all of that stuff is, which I think is good for horror fans. Like, sometimes you don't just want to walk away feeling like uneasy every time you turn a corner. Like sometimes you want to be thrilled that like all the stop motion at the end, like all of those effects, I think to what you're saying, like you really feel like you get your money's worth at the end of this movie.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, your description made me think of it. It really is kind of a horror action film, not in a traditional action movie sense, but in that it never lets up, or if it does, it's just to give you a little breathing space before the next set piece of high octane horror comes at you.
Yeah. It is a deceivingly high octane movie. Now that I think about it.
I mean, it takes a while to get there. Mm-hmm. The first third, pretty much before Cheryl ends up getting possessed. It's got lots of good things in it, still moments. But after that, it's like they just step on the gas and let it go as fast as they can make it go. So
full throttle.
Yeah.
So there is, I think it's within the first third, but also sort of throughout the movie. But like I think the camera work in this film is extremely impressive, especially when you consider the light budget, but also probably because of the light budget, but everything with the sort of like do-it-yourself homemade, we can't even really call it a steady cam, but just like the moving camera that is just like nailed to a board and, sort of like weaving through sticks and trees and leaves and stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sometimes it's just the camera taped with duct tape to Sam Raimi's hand. Yeah. I mean, that's fantastic. And their dolly shots are, the camera is bolted to a U-shaped piece of wood, put on a sawhorse that has been duct taped, and then Vaseline's put on it. So they get that smooth movement.
Yeah.
But it's just the genius of like, well, we can barely afford the 16 millimeter cameras that we borrowed, to make this. We cannot afford a Steadicam in any way, shape, or form. And I mean, like The Shining came out roughly around the same time,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's all Steadicam shots. So the fact that they were able to do some of this stuff on such a shoestring budget, and that 16 millimeter was like their grudging acceptance of the fact that they couldn't do it in 8 millimeter. Yeah. Like they did an 8 millimeter test and then blew it up to 35. And apparently Bruce Campbell said that it was like watching a hailstorm. The grain was so huge. So they shot it in 16 as
As a
a
compromise.
compromise,
Yeah.
and then blew it up to 35.
That is so funny to think about. This movie is coming out like around the same time as The Shining, and also like just a few years after The Exorcist,
Right.
but on a similar, or I guess on the flip side, also a few years after Texas Chainsaw. So like
Right.
the sort of duality, I guess we'll say, of this genre and sort of like what works for it. I feel like most people would say that at its sort of core, at its heart, this genre is at its best when it is this down and dirty kind of vibe. Although you do get great examples of amazing movies that are big budget, have amazing established auteurs tied to them in The Exorcist and The Shining. But like, this in Texas Chainsaw, when you're just getting like a bunch of people who are really just like, like fighting for it and like digging to get the movie made, I feel like that's when you get these like really, really, really special moments within the genre, and kind of at its core, like feels like what the genre is supposed to be. I don't know if you feel the same way about.
Oh yeah,
about that.
no, absolutely. I think you could go back into the 1960s and say that Night of the Living Dead is the same sort of thing. It's independent filmmaking that kind of changes how movies are made. You get Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the 70s. You've got Evil Dead in the 80s. And then I would say probably Blair Witch Project in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And that kind of changed things, or at least introduced a whole new genre to people and made it something that people could do on an extremely low budget. I'm not sure that there's anything in the last 20 years that you could point to. I'm sure somebody's going to say, well, but
Yeah.
In the 2010s and the 2000s, were there filmmakers that did that same sort of magic of changing how things were by having to do something with very little? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say like Paranormal Activity is probably just like a continuation of the Blair Witch Project sort of vibe. So I don't think that there's really been anything within the last. Blair Witch Project was 25 years ago. So I don't know if there's been anything in the last 25 years that has sort of, dug into what it is that makes a lot of these films so special in their DIY nature, the independent sort of vibe and aesthetic that they're creating and building, and really just like movies that are these like pure, just like forces of will,
Right. Yeah. No, I agree.
As opposed to being studio backed or, having at least like a bit more money. Even like studio backed horror movies are fairly cheap in the grand scheme of things, but a movie like The Evil Dead was made for like, like a couple of pennies.
Right. I think 2/3, like the vast bulk of on location shooting was shot with a budget of $85,000. And I think they ended up spending something north of 300,000 with pickups and doing all kinds of other stuff, the editing and audio and all of that stuff that they had to do afterwards. But the fact that they were like, we need to make this film for $150,000. All we could raise was $85,000. Screw it. Let's do it anyway.
Yeah. And then that's when you get cameras nailed to boards.
Yes.
That are being, randomly shown through trees and leaves and stuff. But to me, like, that's one of the scariest parts of the movie, is like, that is a great way to communicate that there is this weird, scary entity that is out there and we don't know what it is, and we're getting its point of view, but it's kind of sloppy in the way that it moves through the woods. Like, it ends up being the perfect way to communicate that.
Yeah. Nope. I absolutely agree. It doesn't necessarily make sense in the context of the movie, because what is it exactly? I mean, they don't even awaken the demons until they play the resurrection passages. So what is it that's out in the woods already? Doesn't matter. It's scary as hell.
Yeah, doesn't matter. It's spooky. It's upsetting. It's you know, all that stuff. But then if you have a budget like The Shining and you're doing that with a Steadicam, I don't think that it works the same way.
Right. Yeah, it gives you a completely different feel. I mean, even if you go to movies like Friday the 13th Part 2, which made heavy use of Steadicam in a great way to show they had a multi-level sequence where one of the survivors is running towards the camera and the Steadicam is allowing you to see Jason in the background chasing them. Mm-hmm. But it's a completely different feel than the original Friday the 13th, where they didn't have access to that stuff. And it's a more raw experience for that as well.
Yeah.
I brought up The Shining specifically because Sam Raimi always brags that when Evil Dead was released in the UK, it was also released on VHS like that same month. Like it was almost a simultaneous release. It was one of the first times that it ever happened. And the sales figures for the week that it came out, Evil Dead was number 1 and The Shining was number 3. Nice. So he has that like on his door somewhere where Evil Dead beat The Shining at video rentals.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. I think it's well documented how much I love The Shining, yes. But still amazing for Sam Raimi and
then The Shining got to stay in distribution, and the video nasty phenomenon forced Evil Dead off the shelves in the UK until like, I don't know, 2000, something like that, where it could be released unedited.
Yeah. Okay. The sort of a random side thing that I was thinking, but I have to ask the question. Did this kick off the Cabin in the Woods sort of subgenre of horror movies?
Right. I think even if it didn't, and there may have been, essentially Friday the 13th is a young people go to cabins in the woods, but this is definitely the film that cemented it as a trope in horror movies. There might be movies that did it before, but if you think about what's the first Cabin in the Woods movie you can think of, this is the one that has to come up.
Well, I guess with Friday the 13th, it's a little different because that's like kids go to cabins and are attacked by, psycho slasher guy or psycho slasher guy's mom. This is kids go to the cabin and there's some weird supernatural stuff that's happening.
Right. Well, you get that played with in Cabin in the Woods, right? The actual movie Cabin in the Woods, where the potential things that could kill somebody, some young people in a cabin in the woods, run from, redneck murder family, through demons, through to mermen, possibly. Yeah. So it plays with that whole run. I love Cabin in the Woods, and that playing with the whole idea of kids go to the cabin in the woods and bad stuff happens to them. It could be any number of things. I mean, Eli Roth's first film there, which I didn't really like and don't own, so it's hard for me to remember. Cabin Fever.
Oh yeah.
That's another kind of homage to this sort of filmmaking. But yeah, they all owe a debt to Evil Dead.
Yeah, and again, to like put this into a bit of a larger context, it is really interesting how these movies, these like independent movies with these really low budgets, end up being the ones that sort of like birth these new genres within the genre, or these new subgenres within the genre. So Night of the Living Dead gives us zombie movies. Texas Chainsaw, yes, we had like Psycho that was a slasher movie, but Texas Chainsaw really gives us the idea of this like otherworldly demonic slasher creature,
Yeah.
you know? And then that carries through with Friday the 13th and Halloween and all that stuff. Evil Dead gives us kids go to cabin and bad stuff happens, right? Like in ways that the big budget movies like The Exorcist or The Shining, things like that are sort of like based on existing tropes within the genre, but it is like these DIY movies that are creating new stories to tell within the horror umbrella as a whole, which I think is super interesting.
Yeah, I think it's, in a healthy cinema system, I think independents feed ideas into the studio system. And in some ways, a really good breakout in the studio system will cause independents to be like, well, that was good, but what if we do this instead? And they should feed off each other in a way that I think sometimes gets broken down.
100%. It just seems like there's not a lot of not push and pull, but really just like pushing of, okay, well, you're doing this. What if we take that and do this with it?
Right.
Sort of. Yeah. Like not competition, but sort of exactly what you're saying. Just, inspiration, we'll say, a back and forth inspiration. We've talked about them, here and there throughout, but we should give some time to celebrate the amazing Bruce Campbell and what it is that he's doing here. And just like how much of a shame it is that he hasn't had opportunities to do much outside of this franchise. But what do you think of him in particular in this movie?
It's funny in this movie. He really is, I think the phrase that I used is only a shadow of the chin he would become. He's not quite as iconic in this character as he would become, but you can see him get better. That early shot of him sort of schmoozing the camera, looking directly at the camera, is indicative of just how little experience that he had at the time, other than being in these sort of 8mm comedies. But by the end of it, he's really selling this poor schmuck being stuck in a cabin with possessed demons, trying to survive until sunup. And he really does develop this character of Ash as somebody who is maybe a little bit weedy, but when the push comes to shove, he will actually be able to take a punch or five and survive whatever gets thrown at him. And I think he's actually a fairly decent actor when he's given the opportunity to do that. He's really made a niche for himself as a B movie actor and as a television actor in, things like the Xena Warrior Princess shows, and he's had a couple of his own shows, The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr., for instance, and he was in Burn Notice as a supporting character for a while, but he really got pigeonholed into being a B movie supporting player, but he embraced that. He's totally made that his shtick and still makes a living doing those sorts of appearances. It is too bad he didn't get an opportunity to do more serious roles, but I love him unreservedly as the epitome of a certain kind of movie actor that we don't get much anymore,
and don't fully appreciate, which is probably why we don't get as many as we should. Is he a top 5 final girl?
Right. That's a good question. I think he absolutely is. I mean, he is, especially in this movie, but
Yeah.
in all of them, really. But definitely in this one, he is the final girl.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's a great take. I love it.
I think in one of your articles about this, you called him a scream queen, which
Yeah.
he kind of is. He's up there. It's like him, Jamie Lee Curtis, like he's
Yeah.
he's a
Yep.
legit final girl, scream queen, all of it.
Yep. He's
Yeah,
a
that's
survivor,
equality.
baby.
That's the equality that we want. We
Yeah.
need a dude up there on the Mount Rushmore of final girl scream queens.
Yep.
And Bruce Campbell's Ash is that for us. He's our representation.
Yeah. It's fine. I have friends who are like, he doesn't get to be Ash until Evil Dead 2. In Evil Dead 1, he's Ashley.
He's still Ashley. Yeah. A name that is gender neutral enough for him to be a final girl.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it totally works. Yeah.
I buy it.
It totally works for me.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, that's all that I had on the Evil Dead. I don't know if you had any other topics or specifics that you wanted to talk about in regards to this film.
I don't think so. My head is full of completely useless information about the making of this film, which is in part because the filmmakers have been so forthcoming about the process of not just the production of the film, but also the post-production and the distribution. They really have, in their commentaries and their books, given a history of how film was made and sold in the early 80s. Little details like the fact that Irvin Shapiro was the man that took up selling the film for them, and that this guy who was in his 70s at the time was also the guy who sold Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and the Battleship Potemkin to American audiences. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And they got this guy who they only picked because he actually also worked with George Romero, but turned out to be one of the true solid gentlemen left in film at a time when they really needed it. He asked them about, all right, well, do you have production stills? Do you have a trailer? Do you have any of these things that you need to sell a film? And they didn't. And they had used every penny to finish the film, to the point where they had taken out loans at 20% interest.
Yikes.
To finish this film. And he fronted the money in order for them to get all these things, the posters, the stills that they used to sell, the package that they would give distributors. He paid for Sam to go to Cannes, where Stephen King saw it, and gave them that great quote about it being the most ferociously original horror film of the year. And that really helped them sell it too. So I think, I can't remember if it was on Army of Darkness or if it was the Evil Dead film that came out in the 2000s, the remake. But they dedicated it to him, because without him, they would never have gotten it into a distribution scheme. And they made a deal with New Line in the U.S., but they got hardly any money from them. Almost all of the money that they used to pay their people back was from foreign distribution, which wouldn't have happened if he hadn't sent them to Cannes. So he's as much responsible for us getting to see Evil Dead as the crew.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to give a shout out to him. And
absolutely, a very worthwhile shout out. Good man. Just
yeah.
Sometimes, within movie history, sometimes you just need one person who sort of believes in a project, who can really take it to that next level where we're all able to appreciate it the ways that we should be able to appreciate it.
Yeah. Oh, and there is one more, because it's related to other films. I think some of their films in the canon, but maybe not. We'll find out. But So they had to hire an editor for the film, and they got a woman named Edna Paul, whose assistant turned out to be Joel Cohen. Which is, so that was how they met, the Cohen brothers.
Yeah.
And the Cohen brothers were trying to get their own film made at the time, and so they ended up hanging out and spending some time with them and talking about how did they get their film done. And they told them, shoot a promo, do a proof of concept. And so they actually shot a proof of concept with Bruce Campbell, like hauling himself wounded down a road to sell to people. And that became Blood Simple.
Amazing.
So that was, with one of those weird connections. And of course they've gone on to do great things since then. So I love that little tidbit.
But again, that's just like, that goes to what we were talking about at the beginning of, you're never going to know if you have it until you do it. So the fact that Sam Raimi and this crew just went out and made The Evil Dead, right? That inspired a young Joel and Ethan Cohen to be like, hey, we should just go out and do it too. And, if they hadn't had that inspiration from The Evil Dead, who knows? Maybe there's also a timeline where we don't have their entire filmography to look back on.
Yeah.
So, and for every Joel and Ethan Cohen out there were 100 Raph Stitz who, tried to make something and it ends up being dog shit because they're not actually good at making movies. But
you're still young enough to go out there and try again. Make more. I will send you a link to the trailer for the stupid movie that me and my family tried to make. Amazing. You will see what terrible filmmaking really is.
There's a good chance that ends up getting linked in this episode description.
Oh dear.
for all of our screenagers to see. I love it. Who knows? Maybe it'll be a recommendation for today.
It won't.
I haven't seen it, so I can't recommend it.
Yeah, no, nobody can.
Before we go to recommendations, it is wild that this little, movie made for, a couple of pennies and a box of donuts or whatever. I totally butchered that. Whatever that saying actually is. But this movie that was made for nothing ended up spawning an amazing franchise, some great sequels, some reboots, remakes, spin-offs. I think there's a TV series. What do you think of the rest of the franchise and like the sort of like commercialization of The Evil Dead? Like, it's weird that this movie is one that has spawned like an entire economy around it. But what do you think of all that other stuff?
Well, it's funny because, you have this discussion of for the longest time, Evil Dead was a cult film. Mm-hmm. But can you call something a cult film when it's spawned 5 feature films and a television series with 3 seasons and all of that stuff that comes with Evil Dead? So if it was a regular franchise, if it was, a Friday the 13th or a Nightmare on Elm Street or whatever, and that gets all of these extended toy lines and book lines and games and stuff, you don't talk about that as exploiting it. But because it started as a cult favorite, it feels a little bit like it's being, but the appetite is there. And I think that at some point in time, they just had to embrace the fact that there were always going to be people who were happy to, see a new Evil Dead film, to watch or play Evil Dead video games, as terrible as some of those have been, to read, Ash versus the Evil Dead comics. As long as there's an audience and a market for it, I cannot blame them for saying, yeah, this is now a real franchise, and that means merchandising and go for it.
Yeah.
So
It also, I mean, I haven't watched like too many of the reboots or sequels or anything, but it also seems like they haven't really like watered down the original with like too much world building, too much, lore and all that stuff. In ways that like we're thinking of like the Alien franchise and
right,
Ridley Scott's desire to like really dig into the lore and mythology around the franchise, and that sort of feeling like it waters down the rest of the movies. Like, it's fine, we don't need all this world building. It's like the first movie is about an alien hunting people down. That's cool. That's sick. We don't need anything else. And it feels like this movie or this franchise could have easily gotten some remakes and sequels and reboots and stuff that like dig a little too much into the world building, but it seems like I haven't heard that complaint from the fan base.
right.
Is that true? Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I have not seen Rise of the Evil Dead yet. It's on the stack of things to be watched, but for whatever reason, I tend to wait. I didn't see the remake of Evil Dead for a few years after it was released.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the most world building, honestly, we get is probably Army of Darkness,
Mm-hmm.
because that takes place in the past.
Yeah.
But it's all tongue in cheek and not followed on too seriously. Like there's not somebody like the Marvel movies, unfortunately have to sit and kind of work out the continuity of all of this stuff. And you don't have anybody with Evil Dead saying, well,
Mm-hmm.
in the recording in the original Evil Dead says Naturon Demonto, and that actually in Latin mean,
Yeah.
and maybe it's just the nature of the kind of film. The film doesn't take itself so seriously. The series doesn't take itself
Yeah.
that seriously. So
We
the
never get a
fans,
midi chlorians moment.
no, oh god, yep,
But I mean, to what you're saying, it seems like because of the nature of the film and the series, like it's just like why we wouldn't ever have to get that moment. It would be something like that would be so antithetical to like what the entire franchise is and like stands for, that it would be so ridiculous to
right.
even like suggest something like that.
And I think they've kind of embraced the whole idea of this is a concept that can be played more straight, or it's a concept that can be played more like Army of Darkness. And so,
Mm-hmm.
the continuation of the original film that goes through the Ash versus the Evil Dead TV series. So it includes the first three films, I think of as a separate line from the remake of Evil Dead and from Rise,
Mm-hmm.
that are played far more seriously, still way over the top gore, but they take the concept of the Book of the Dead and the demons possessing people and this kind of body horror stuff, and they play it as straight as they can with the concept, and that's totally fine too. It contains enough to be able to accommodate different ways of approaching the same material. So even the first three films all have
Mm-hmm.
different tones to them.
Yeah. Great stuff. Well, we will be talking about Evil Dead 2 at some point on this
Right.
show, because that is
Otherwise, that would
also
have been a
in the canon.
recommendation for sure.
Yeah, I think that's the only other one that's within
I
the
hope
the
so.
canon,
God.
but
I mean, I love
which
Army of
means,
Darkness, but I don't want it in the canon.
yeah, so that means Army of Darkness, the remake from 2012 or 13 or whenever, that's also fair game for recommendation. So yeah, I think with that we can jump into whatever it is that we're recommending for the Evil Dead. If
Sounds good.
you're if you're ready to go, Bob, I'm ready to go as well.
Let's do it.
Let's jump in. I'm not going to go through the rules again because
everybody knows the rules.
Everybody knows the rules. And if you don't know the rules, just ask and we'll tell you. So with that, let's do recommendations. Bob, you'll go first and then I'll give my first one and then we'll, see what we've got.
Alrighty. So my first recommendation is my one film recommendation. All my recommendations are related. This is probably the least related, but most of them are related directly to Evil Dead. Mm-hmm. This one is actually the 1970 indie horror film Equinox by Jack Woods and Dennis Murin. It's a very low budget horror movie about a group of friends who go into the woods, find a cabin where a doctor has found a book of a veritable Bible of evil, I think is what it's called. And they uses it to cause demon summoning that possesses people and turns them into these crazed demon things. There are all kinds of stop motion monster effects. That's probably one of the things that it stands out as. I think people have referred to it as Evil Dead by way of Ray Harryhausen. There are a lot of notes in this film that are echoed in Evil Dead, enough that people are like, some of the filmmakers must have seen Equinox before making Evil Dead. It's very low budget. I think it was made for like $8,000, something like that. But it's still fun, and it's still got some joy watching it. And it's another low budget film made by a bunch of friends together, doing as much as they could with what they had. It's a Criterion release, so I think you can still get that.
Awesome.
As well.
Nice. Might have to check that out. That sounds... Yeah, the connections are pretty apparent. I like that. I am going to recommend 3 movies.
Okay.
All seem like pretty obvious choices, but it's kind of hard for me to think of, more creative connections or recommendations for this movie. So the first movie that I'm going to recommend is another movie that was made on a shoestring budget by a young filmmaker who was really just like trying to get their foot in the door and said, screw it, let's make this just to see if we can make a movie. This is one of the first like super extremely low budget movies that I was introduced to early in my film watching days. I'm recommending Robert Rodriguez's El Mariachi.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
That was a big one for me when I was, 14, 15. Very much so a movie that you come across if you go down the Tarantino path of introduction to film.
Yeah.
Then El Mariachi very much so becomes like the example of here's how you make a movie for $0.
Yep. Fantastic choice. I think that's a good example of that. Yeah. Of making the best thing that you can with what you have, and seeing, someone with obvious skill and ability, making a pretty amazing film with very little, and launching a whole career. Basically. Kind
of like Sam Raimi then launches a career that is both like confusing and sprawling in amazing ways,
Yes. It's, and I know this is kind of an aside, but Sam Raimi made all kinds of films, but I chart a kind of clear progression of this is somebody who obviously wants to make big budget feature films, even though he has this. But then you have people like Rodriguez, who makes, Spy Kids, in addition to Planet Terror. And it reminds me more of the the guy who directed the Reanimator there, Howard Gordon.
I can't help you.
Stuart Gordon. There we go. Jesus. Anyway, this is a guy who made one of the goriest splatter films of all time, and also made Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. He's got that's a very, your brain's like, what? Or, that the guy who created Mad Max and did Fury Road also did Happy Feet.
Yeah.
So
just amazing.
Yeah. So great choice. Sorry to digress.
No, great digression. We love it. What's your second recommendation?
All right. So my second recommendation is actually a commentary track.
Oh, nice.
So the commentary track for Evil Dead 2 is one of the most entertaining pieces related to cinema I've ever listened to. It's so much fun, a lot of behind the scenes stuff, a lot of interaction between all of the people who helped make the film, including Raimi and Tapper and Campbell and some of the other folks. It's funny enough that my friends and I who quote Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2 actually quote the commentary almost as much.
That's amazing.
It's well worth a listen to. In fact, I'm not even sure. Oops, that's my watch. I'm not even sure when the last time that I watched the movie without the commentary was.
Oh wow!
So,
okay,
highly recommend it.
I'm gonna have to check that out. Whenever Evil Dead 2, canon episode comes around, I'll watch the movie and then I'll watch the movie with the commentary. That's what I'm going to do. That's how we're going to do it.
All right.
For my second recommendation, I'm going to go with another Sam Raimi movie because he's a legend. And this is a movie that has been discussed at length since its release. A lot of back and forth on it. And I'm within the camp that thinks that it is I don't want to say masterpiece, but certainly something that is underrated and underappreciated, especially in what it could have been. And the bones are very much so there. I'm recommending Spider-Man 3 because that movie could have been so special if it were not for studio interference.
Yeah.
And there are many moments like the what's the guy's name? The Sandman, when he is like regenerating into his like human form from sand. That's like one of the most spectacular moments in any comic book movie.
Yeah.
And that movie could have been just like a lot of that if it weren't for, studios doing studio things.
Yeah.
So I will always be a defender of Spider-Man 3, and that's why I'm recommending it.
Fantastic. That's I probably have not seen Spider-Man 3 in 20 years.
I watch it quarterly.
Nice. I need to check it out again, apparently.
Yeah.
and try and look at the bones and not just the details. So
yeah.
All right. Added to the list. Excellent. All right. So my last recommendation is a book.
Nice.
It is If Chins Could Kill, Confessions of a B-Movie Actor, Bruce Campbell's autobiography.
Nice.
It's my copy is actually signed. It says, "Hey, Bob, I didn't know you could read, you bastard." So
that's amazing.
One of my favorite possessions.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic book. It has a lot of background information on the making of not just Evil Dead, but all of the Evil Dead series, and just tidbits from a life spent making B movies. It's eminently readable, full of great anecdotes and technical details, and highly recommend it.
That's awesome. Does Bruce know that his chin is your avatar on pretty much everything.
I doubt it, but I'm sure I'm not the only one that has something similar.
It's amazing. It is a great photo. Every time I see it, I smile.
Yeah.
That's a great recommendation. I love it. I'm not a big audiobook guy, but I feel like that would be a great audiobook.
Oh yeah. I'm not a big audiobook person either, but I think you'd be right.
Yeah. Sweet. So for my third recommendation, there is a moment within this movie where one of the possessed girls, I'm pretty sure it's Cheryl who does it to Linda. There's a very, very gruesome heel stabbing moment. And for some reason, a heel stab or anything with heels ends up being, more unsettling than most forms of violence that you can get in a movie. So, Bob, I know you're not a torture porn kind of guy, but I was thinking of another pretty famous heel stab, heel slice scene and moment within a film. And you mentioned him before. I'm going with Eli Roth's Hostel as my third recommendation because heel stab stuff is, it's tough.
Yeah.
But both movies feature a moment where that happens. Really just want to, gross you out.
Yeah. No, I still haven't seen Hostel. I'm not a big fan of Eli Roth stuff, but that's a distressing scene. And even knowing that's them, the sound effect is them plunging a knife into an apple doesn't change how gross it sounds when that happens. Yeah. I can't say that I enjoy that recommendation, but I appreciate it.
So you're not a fan of him, but you have seen Hostel or you have not?
I have not seen Hostel. I've seen a handful of Eli Roth films.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that he's done that I've actually ever enjoyed was the trailer for Thanksgiving in the Grindhouse.
Yeah,
films.
Not the actual Thanksgiving.
Not the actual, which I still haven't seen, but
yeah, he's an interesting figure, we'll say, and also very much so down the Tarantino path, right? You're like Tarantino, and then you're like, oh, his buddy Robert Rodriguez, and you're like, oh, this guy's pretty cool too, and then you're like, their other buddy Eli Roth, and you're like, oh, this guy's not as talented as his two friends, but that's okay.
But he's very enthusiastic.
Yeah, he loves cinema, which you have to give him points for that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. I as a filmmaker, I appreciate his interest and education and enthusiasm. I just, for whatever reason, his films rub me raw. So
yeah, there's he's also kind of like, if you're like, he's down like the Brian De Palma Hitchcock tree, like like in football they have like coaching trees,
right?
If you're looking at it as like a directing tree, we were like, okay, De Palma was just trying to do Hitchcock, and then Eli Roth is like, okay, what if I did like the most effed up version of De Palma doing Hitchcock and gave you that? And it's like, oh, it's a little too much.
Yeah. It's how if you can reduce a sauce to its most intense element, and then everything just tastes like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh man. Okay. Well, that's far too much time that we've spent on Eli Roth in this episode, or in the in this entire show in general.
Right.
So, Bob, before we say goodbye, let's run through recommendations one last time. What do you got for us?
All right. My first recommendation was 1970 film Equinox by Jack Woods and Dennis Murren. Something that seems like it would probably a obvious inspiration for the storyline of Evil Dead, and kind of a fun little low budget movie all on its own. My second recommendation was the commentary soundtrack to Evil Dead 2. I feel like I should Caveat that was specific to the 25th anniversary edition. It might be the only one that they've ever done, but I know they've done multiple ones for the first movie, and some of them are not as fun as the others. So let me say 25th anniversary edition, that's the specific soundtrack I'm talking about, a commentary track. And my third recommendation was Bruce Campbell's autobiography, If Chins Could Kill, Confessions of a B-Movie Actor.
Amazing. Great recommendations. I got 3 movies. My first recommendation is Robert Rodriguez's El Mariachi. My second recommendation is Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3. And my third recommendation is Eli Roth's Hostel.
Nice.
Amazing. We did it. Well,
excellent.
That was great. Listener, as we said on the front end, we are still celebrating Bobtober all October, which means you're going to be getting more Bob next week. But before we talk about what we're going to be talking about on that episode, Bob, are you doing anything else for Bobtober on the ScreamAge Wasteland website? What can people expect to see or already see from you over there?
Right. Well, they just published the Canon post for War of the Worlds, the 1953 George Pal produced classic.
Amazing.
That's up. It should have been published last week. And then we've got Fear Flashback Friday, still going strong with that. I also contributed a bunch of entries to Sailor's Epic 500 list of greatest horror movie characters. And that's publishing every day this month until they run out of days, apparently.
Is it 10 characters at a time? 10 characters per day? Or
it's 25 characters at a time. So,
wow. That is quite the list. Very epic, but very much so worth checking out, as well as all the Fear Flashback Fridays, the War of the Worlds Canon post. I think all the other Canon posts for this month are also spooky related, so that's fun. We're celebrating the season here on the Canon. Like I said, next week we've got more Bobtober celebrations with a movie that I think is another one of your favorites, Bob, if I remember correctly.
Often in the top spot, actually.
Oh, okay. This is going to be exciting. Listener, next week, Bob and I are going to be talking Bride of Frankenstein. Yeah. So if you have not seen that classic, definitely go watch it before you come back and listen to our conversation about that. It will be another very insightful episode with ScreamAge Wasteland's #1 horror expert, the one and only Mr. Bob Cram. Bob, thanks again for joining. We'll see you again next week. Listeners, we hope to see you as well.